Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Nerd Mode. This being a show where I introduce you to a series that you may or may not be familiar with. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the sci-fi original series Van Helsing. Like always, this isn't a review, it's just me talking about a series that I really like that I recommend you check out for yourself. Van Helsing is a fantasy horror drama that follows a woman named Vanessa who wakes up from being in a coma for 3 years only to find out that the world has been overrun by vampires. Basically, a volcano erupted, ash filled the sky and covered up the sun, which vampires which had been dormant and in hiding are now were able to kind of be out on the surface and kind of eventually take over the world. There's a little bit more complexity to that, but we'll kind of leave it at that for now. Vanessa, along with a long list of characters and other survivors, fight to survive in this vampire-ridden world. I should also note that the core cast of characters that you follow has changed quite a bit as the series has progressed. But what started as a mere fight for survival shifts into so much more when it's discovered that Vanessa might just be the key to changing the tide of this whole apocalypse. One of the things I think is really interesting about this series is the apocalypse angle itself. Rather than it being like a zombie situation, which it typically would be under these circumstances, it turns out rather than zombies, it's vampires. So kind of elaborating more on something that I brought up earlier, it is interesting that the show does kind of start off with this whole like survival aspect to it, that it is simply like, oh, we're trying to survive in this apocalyptic world, which that element is constant throughout the entire series. It actually lends itself very nicely to the horror element to the series. However, the show has also done a really good job expanding beyond just that, doing a lot of interesting world building, even diving into the history of the vampires themselves. Another neat thing I like about this show too is the fact that from the very beginning we learned that Vanessa isn't just some ordinary human. In fact, she has some very superhuman abilities. Obviously, I don't want to dive too deeply into that because there's a lot of like major spoilers associated with that, but one key ability I think I should, talk about is the fact is that Vanessa is discovered to have the ability to cure vampirism. Like I said, once again, I won't elaborate too much just because there are major events in the show that are connected to it, but it is really interesting when they kind of dive into that. What I also like is the fact is that the show doesn't shy away from elaborating on why and how Vanessa ended up getting these abilities in the first place, even diving deep into her family history, even their connections to vampires. And speaking of vampires, what's also interesting about this series is the fact is that there are actually different categories of vampires. For example, there are pharaohs. They're more kind of like your zombie level vampires. They kind of don't have any mind of their own. They're very driven by instinct, their need to feed on people and animals. And then another group would be the ancients. They're the ones that are more human-like in the sense that they can think and plan. They're actually kind of the ones that are in charge to a certain extent. These are just two examples. Obviously, I don't want to dive too much into the other categories just because that starts entering spoiler territory as well, but it's really interesting when you kind of learn more about vampirism in this series. This show has everything. It is very action-packed. It is filled to the brim with drama, which I'd even go as far as saying in some occasion it is borderline bleak. But at the same time, there are also instances where the show has shown its more humorous side as well. As I brought up earlier, the show does also have a horror element to it as well. It can be a little scary. It can definitely be gory in many different occasions. The show is fantasy, in particular dark fantasy, but what I think is also interesting, there are certain elements kind of hinting that the show has a bit of a science fictional element to it as well. Obviously, don't want to go too deep into explaining that, but when you watch the show, you kind of get what I'm meaning when I'm referencing the science fictional end. Van Helsing is inspired by a comic book series called Helsing. Season 4 of Van Helsing premieres on September 27th. Early, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.